Around the Western world, no other country is idolized more than Japan, but for the people actually living there, the picture looks very different. In 2025, a global survey on well-being revealed just 13% of Japanese respondents were happy with their life, the lowest on record. This has given rise to a phenomenon known as Johatsu, literally evaporated people, where tens of thousands of people just disappear from their families and jobs, often driven by debt, family pressures, or even overwhelming work culture. Beyond just making people unhappy, these trends are at the heart of a phenomenon which is quietly hollowing out the country. 2025 marked a record, with the number of deaths exceeding the number of births, a first since the 1800s, and Japan is set to lose nearly 30% of its population by 2070. The government has desperately tried to fix this, from offering baby bonuses to childcare subsidies, but at least as of yet, none of this seems to be working. The truth is that this collapse is the result of a pressure buried much deeper, a society that places intense need on individuals to succeed, all with an economy that has remained largely stagnant for over 3 decades, leaving fewer and fewer people able to meet those expectations. So increasingly, people are choosing to opt out of life altogether. This is how living in Japan became awful. Looking at Japan today, and you wouldn't be mistaken for assuming that it was one of the most advanced societies in the world, at least on the surface. It's a country of hyper-efficient cities, world-leading rail infrastructure, and robots that now quietly handle work that humans once did. At the same time, it's a society which was remarkably disjointed. Over 38% of households are made up of just a single person, making Japan one of the most isolated countries in the world. Things have become so severe that in 2021, the government went as far as creating an entire ministry dedicated to tackling loneliness and social isolation. Many Western observers put this simply down to the philosophy of Confucianism, a philosophy that places heavy emphasis on respecting authority and maintaining harmony, often at the expense of emotional openness. Over time, that can create strong pressure to conform and keep personal struggles private, leading to an increasingly isolated society. But while it would be easy to point to deep-rooted cultural values alone, the truth is that there's actually a lot more going on here. Over the past 80 years, the country has changed more than you might expect, going from one of the poorest nations in the world to one of the richest. But what began as a purely economic fix ended up reshaping nearly every part of Japanese life, creating enormous prosperity on paper, but quietly transforming Japanese society in the process. At the start of the 1950s, the country was in a dire strait. After the Second World War, average incomes collapsed by nearly 50% to the equivalent of just $2,000 a year today, less than the average incomes in Syria. But rather than locking the country into permanent decline, this collapse ended up setting the stage for one of the most remarkable economic transformations in history. Between the early 1950s and the early 1990s, average incomes exploded, growing by more than 10 times. That came hand in hand with a radical political transformation. In the space of a single generation, Japan moved away from an authoritarian wartime state, where people were frequently arrested for simply criticizing the government, to effectively a modern liberal democracy. On paper, it had almost everything needed to match, or even outperform, the world's most successful countries. And in a lot of ways, it was. By the start of the 1990s, Japan actually had a higher life expectancy than the US and the UK, and some of the highest levels of education attainment in the developed world. But while on most metrics, Japan was starting to look like a fully developed, rich country, there was one area where it clearly wasn't: working hours. Despite what you might expect, typically as countries get richer, people end up gradually working less and less. As economies shift from farms to factories to offices, it takes less time to produce the same amount of economic value. That means workers can earn roughly the same income as before, while spending fewer hours at work, a pattern we've seen play out across most developed countries over the past century. But in Japan, this simply never happened, at least not to the same extent. By the 1990s, people were still working around double the amount in the US, despite the fact that by this point, it was already one of the most advanced and productive economies in the world. Because firms demanded near loyalty, with workers often staying at one company for their entire life, staying in the office until 8 or 9 PM was routine, even when there wasn't actually any work to do. That culture gave rise to a phenomenon known as karoshi, literally death from overwork. By the late 80s and 1990s, the Japanese government was officially recognizing cases of fatal heart attacks, strokes, and suicides caused by excessive working hours, with thousands of compensation claims being filed each year. But more than just creating a few tragic edge cases, such an intense work culture ended up fundamentally reshaping how Japanese society functioned. So much time was required to be spent at work that people increasingly began to sacrifice friendships and even relationships for it. Since the start of the country's economic boom, marriage rates have rapidly declined, falling by over 50% in just a couple of generations. Today, over 38% of households now consist of a single person, and surveys consistently find Japan ranking near the top for reported social isolation. As early as the 1980s, the government demographic surveys and population white papers were already warning about falling marriage rates and a growing share of people delaying or avoiding marriage altogether. But the thing is, at the time, most people thought that these problems were just transitional. As the country grew richer and wages rose, people would eventually start working less, leaving more time for life outside of work. But then, in another twist that nobody really could have predicted, the opportunity for that adjustment vanished almost overnight. On October 20th, 1987, in the wake of the global Black Monday crash, Japan's stock market fell by nearly 15% in a single day, the largest one-day decline in history. Over the next few days, the Nikkei would continue to slide, eventually losing around 60% of its value from its peak, a collapse more than twice as severe as the US stock market's loss after the 2008 financial crash. It was the worst economic shock Japan had seen in generations, and one the government quickly discovered it had little ability to reverse. The boom of the previous decade had pulled in huge volumes of foreign capital, pushing asset prices to extreme levels. By the late 1980s, the land beneath Tokyo's Imperial Palace was famously estimated to be worth more than all the real estate in California combined. Asset prices were no longer tied to rents or profits, but to the assumption that someone else would always pay more. Realizing the danger, the central bank finally stepped in, raising interest rates in an attempt to slow borrowing and cool the markets. But by that point, the economy was extremely dependent on cheap credit, and when that disappeared, the system quickly fell apart. Within a few years of the interest rate hike, commercial land prices fell by more than 80%, dragging the wider economy down with them. Of course, a financial crisis driven by investors getting overexcited about asset prices isn't exactly new, but in the Japanese case, this crash was so disastrous that the country has never really recovered. What followed became known as Japan's lost decades, a period in which the economy was basically stagnant for entire generations. In the decades leading up to the crisis, wages were rising by more than 10% every year, but since then, that rate has slowed closer to 2%. That might not sound like the worst thing in the world. The country by this point was still one of the richest in the world, even if it wasn't experiencing as much economic growth by that point. People still had access to modern healthcare, safe cities, high-quality infrastructure, and living standards that seemed unimaginable just a few generations earlier. But the thing is, the fact that people are better off in absolute terms can be almost irrelevant. What matters just as much, if not more, is whether life feels like it's getting better. Here is a list of countries ranked by how much they expect their life quality to have improved in 5 years' time. Unsurprisingly, the countries with the fastest rates of economic growth, India, Mexico, and Indonesia, all have the highest rates. Intuitively, that makes a lot of sense. When economic growth has been strong in the past, people likely expect it to continue into the future, so they'll expect their lives to continue to improve. But what is a lot more surprising is that the fact that the countries which people expect their lives to improve also tend to be the ones who rate their current life quality the highest. India, Indonesia, and Mexico all come out on top again. That's all despite the fact that average income in all of these countries are less than half of that in Japan or France. The point is, when it comes to how happy people are, whether they believe their lives are going to improve in the future often matters far more than how rich they are today. And for Japan, that's a serious problem. For nearly 3 decades, living standards have been basically flat. So it's not exactly surprising that people don't expect their lives to suddenly start getting better. In some ways, the country may be suffering from its earlier success. After decades of extraordinarily rapid growth, it industrialized, urbanized, and caught up with the world's richest economies so quickly that there was very little obvious room left to keep expanding at the same pace. And that slowdown in economic growth has left people increasingly dissatisfied with their lives. This is all only made worse by the fact that Japan remained locked into societal norms built for a high-growth era, extremely long working hours, rigid career paths, and delayed personal lives, even after the economic growth needed to justify those sacrifices has disappeared. Given this, it might be tempting to conclude that lower reported happiness in Japan is simply a product of a failing economic model. And while all of this certainly has played a role, it misses a key detail: that a huge chunk of Japan's population isn't even in the workforce at all. The over 55 age group now makes up over a third of the country's population, and despite what you might expect, they also happen to be one of the least happy age groups in the country, with self-reported life satisfaction declining steadily from teenage years through to late middle age. This is the complete opposite of what we see happening in the United States, where people tend to become more satisfied with their lives as they get older. At first glance, this seems like a strange contradiction. Japan has one of the best healthcare systems in the world, a relatively generous pension framework, and, of course, old people are largely insulated from the country's intense work culture. On paper, there doesn't seem much to be unhappy about. And to be fair, for about half the population, this picture just about holds true. When looking at happiness ratings of Japanese men over time, we find a similar effect to that in the US. As they get older, they tend to get happier. But when looking at women, the exact opposite happens. As they get older, they tend to become a lot more unsatisfied with their lives, which is why older people on average seem less happy. The reason for this isn't exactly surprising. It has one of the highest gender pay gaps in the developed world, nearly double that of the UK. At the same time, the country consistently ranks near the bottom of rich economies for female representation at the top of companies and political leadership roles. What that means is that in practice, as people move later into their careers, the gap between men and women only grows wider. On top of that, societal expectations around family roles remain heavily gendered. Women are far more likely to take on unpaid caregiving responsibilities, first for children and later for elderly parents or spouses, often stepping back from work entirely as a result. So while it's relatively common for men to continue working into their 60s and even 70s, for many women, that option simply isn't available. All of this creates a society in which aging as a woman is particularly difficult, and this is only becoming more important as the number of older women in Japan continues to rise rapidly. Its average age has risen by nearly a decade since the year 2000, a trend which is only set to continue, and this creates a serious challenge. Sustained economic growth is typically justified on the grounds that it improves living standards, but in Japan's case, rising wealth hasn't done that at all, and despite being one of the most advanced societies in the world, nobody really knows what to do to fix it. What seems to matter far more than economics are the social structures that determine how people experience that prosperity. Rigid work norms, long-standing gender inequality, and heavily prescribed life roles place uneven burdens on different groups, particularly women and the elderly, in ways that compound over time. It's a crucial reminder that becoming rich doesn't automatically translate into a society where people feel their lives are actually getting better. After what we've seen over the past few months with President Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping, and the escalating trade war around the key components of new global supply chains, I want to share a few insights. We already know the facts. Trump enacted 50% tariffs related to copper. The CCP restricted exports of rare earth minerals in October, and more recently, China announced restrictions on silver, and Russia has watched the Trump administration move aggressively around Venezuela's oil industry. What I want to show you is when it comes to lithium, uranium, and a strategic, rarely talked about mineral I'm featuring for the first time on this channel, China holds enormous leverage over the West. Copper, gold, lithium, uranium, and for the first time, molybdenum are 5 key minerals that today's sponsor, Vanguard Mining, ticker symbol UUUFF, on the US exchanges, has direct exposure to across a diversified portfolio in safe, US-friendly jurisdictions. Vanguard Mining is the first sponsor I've ever featured that is this widely diversified across multiple regions and multiple metals. UUFF, available on US exchanges through Interactive Brokers, Schwab, Fidelity, E-Trade, and others. Before I talk you through Vanguard Mining's uranium, lithium, gold, and copper molybdenum projects in Canada, Paraguay, and Argentina, you need to understand the scale of China's dominance. Lithium prices collapsed nearly 90%, bottoming in June 2025, and have already doubled since. The lithium winter is officially over, and China controls roughly 60 to 70% of global lithium chemical processing, giving it enormous leverage through refining, downstream battery scale, and export restrictions on critical processing technology. In copper, UNCTAD reports China imports about 60% of global copper ore and produces over 45% of refined copper. According to Reuters and the International Copper Study Group, China consumes roughly 58% of the world's refined copper, making it the dominant price setter for global electrification. Molybdenum is even more alarming. China controls around 42 to 45% of global production, and in 2025 introduced strict export controls on molybdenum powders and alloys. Following those measures, exports to the West collapsed by over 95% in a single year. This is why Vanguard Mining stands out. Their Brussels Creek project in British Columbia is a gold, copper, palladium exploration asset in the Kamloops mining district. On uranium, energy independence is no longer a talking point, it's national security. Big tech companies like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft are now seeking direct nuclear power deals for 24/7 carbon-free baseload energy, and Vanguard Mining controls over 90,000 hectares in Paraguay's Parana Basin, right next door to Uranium Energy Corp's world-class UT project. In lithium, Vanguard Mining has reclaimed 100% interest in the Politicos 1 lithium salar project in Argentina at no additional cost, offering direct exposure to world-class lithium salars as lithium prices rebound and M&A activity surges. Molybdenum doesn't make the headlines, but it's essential for steel, defense, aerospace, pipelines, and energy infrastructure, and Vanguard Mining's exposure to molybdenum alongside gold, uranium, lithium, and copper make it uniquely positioned. As always, do your own research on this multi-mineral company.